Luke Carlson joins me here today. You can find a lot of his information by heading over to lscarlsonlaw.com. We're going to be talking about HOA law here today.
Thank you. And there's a lot to explore. So this is a perfect home for it.
The concept of writing a book is always so daunting to me. Like, how did you go about this and what made you decide to write it?
Yeah. So if you wind back the tape, we've been in this space for 15 years representing homeowners. And I saw a lot of media stories recently, maybe the last 5 years. And it was complaining about HOAs, these bad HOAs, how horrible they are. What was lacking was really the empowerment piece, the solution. And so 2 years ago or so, I sat down, I said, you know what, I'm going to solve the problem. I'm going to write the solution because that's what we've been doing. We've been in the trenches. We've been on the front line of this, helping homeowners, empowering them. But what was missing in the market was really that sort of book, a tactical guide, how to empower the homeowner against bad HOAs. So I saw the need and sort of gravitated towards that.
Right. Well, can you share your journey into this HOA market a little bit more? Like, we keep hearing the whole concept of there's riches in the niches, but I've never seen anybody, especially a lawyer, focus in on this. I mean, there must have been some outside of you seeing kind of a trend, there must be some more intimate experience here.
Yeah. So we started 15, 16 years ago in real estate and business. Those were the primary verticals. And historically, we saw a lot of business owners come to us and say, I have this business dispute, but I got a really bad HOA dispute as well. And at the time, it was very hard to find an attorney who just represented the homeowner. So we dove into the space and we really realized it was much more complicated than what we initially thought. You were dealing with fiduciary duty, you were dealing with CC&Rs, which are contractual rights. You had case law that was governing all of this. So it became a very complicated ball of wax or space to specialize in. And I think that was the problem with most attorneys. They looked at it, they heard these horror stories, but they really didn't want to touch it because they didn't want to apply the intellectual rigor. But we were very committed at the time to really figuring it out. And once we did, and once we navigated the space, we really became the thought leaders representing homeowners because there was very few attorneys doing it. And once we understood, okay, the homeowner has tremendous power, there's tremendous ways to enforce a homeowner's rights very strategically, we really sort of built that reputation. We built the brand around that level of sophistication. Because again, we were coming from a complicated real estate disputes, complicated business disputes. So we sort of applied that level of lawyering, for lack of a better word, to HOA representation. And it was tremendously successful. And I say successful because we had great success for our client base, the homeowner.
Well, what are some of the common misconceptions homeowners have about HOAs and that you'd like to maybe clarify?
The biggest one is the assumption that they have no power, that the association has all the power. If you sort of take out the educational piece that we've provided and what we've been beating this drum for a long time, I can understand where that misconception comes into play. If the homeowner goes to a board meeting and the board shuts them down, or the board's attorney has been weaponized and tells the homeowner, hey, this is why you're in the wrong. This is why you have no rights. You start to believe that. But it only takes, I think, some thought and a reading of the CC&Rs to realize that that narrative is quite frequently false. The positioning of the HOA is stacked against the homeowner, or at least with the bad HOAs, and there's a lot of bad HOAs. So I think the number one misconception is the lack of homeowner power, when in fact they have tremendous power if it's leveraged correctly and strategically.
This kind of goes to some of our real estate investing, is that we obviously have such a strong misconception regarding HOAs that we will avoid HOA areas to do any kind of flipping or house renovation because we just don't want to deal with them.
Well, that makes sense. Again, I think it might be a very lucrative space if you can get your head around it. And it's one of those things that maybe you avoid until you really understand how do these associations work from a legal perspective? What's the import of the CC&Rs? How does my flipping or my strategy for investment tie into that framework? But it's one of those things I do think it's worth the squeeze if you were to invest time in it and truly understand the space. Because once you understand it, you know your rights, you understand how the game of Monopoly, so to speak, is played. At first, it might seem daunting, but once you understand the mechanisms behind it, I think it becomes a very user-friendly space.
Based on your experience, what are the most frequent issues homeowners face when with their HOA?
Yeah, so I'm a California lawyer, so I can only speak to California, although we do have a marvelous Florida team. But most consistently, I think you have two camps. You have the first camp, which is property damage, right? It's a failure from the association to maintain a common area. And because of that failure, because of that lack of care, there's been a water intrusion event. For example, common area has drainage. The association is meant or has an obligation legally to maintain the drainage system. Big storm comes in, floods, homeowner gets flooded. So that's a property damage. In that case, it would likely be a breach of fiduciary, negligence, at least a violation of the CCNRs, failure to maintain common area elements. So that's a big one. And the other one is harassment, selective enforcement, preferential treatment. That's more of a quality of life scenario that we find a lot of our clients in, unfortunately. So that's the homeowner who, for some reason, the HOA president does not like that homeowner. And so the board president weaponizes their position and starts targeting that homeowner with fines, selective enforcement, that preferential treatment, which is unfortunately a very common theme in Florida, or well, I guess Florida and California.
That's really a shame that we see that type of weaponization at that level.
Well, I think it goes to human nature. In the book, we took a lot of time sort of identifying the common bad actors. When there's an HOA dispute and I'm talking to a homeowner, one of the first things I ask is who's on the board? Who are these people? Because it's typically a personality flaw. You have someone who got on the board because of their need to secure power. It's that tyrant type, right? That drew them to that position. You have the meddler type, the person who jumped on the board because they wanted to meddle in the affairs of other people, not because they wanted to better the community, not because they wanted to approach the space with sort of this altruistic mentality, or you have people on the board who just lack the competence or intellect. They want to be there, I guess, on some level to better the community, but they don't understand the CCNRs. They don't truly understand fiduciary. They don't understand that their role is really to protect and preserve the community, preserve fair market value, and they don't really know how to execute. And then I guess the last bad actor, which again goes to psychology, is the self-dealer, someone who's procured that place on the board to self-profit, if you will. And then that's embezzlement, right? Or some sort of kickback structure. So those are I guess, the usual suspects when it comes to bad HOAs.
So what advice would you give homeowners if they feel a little overwhelmed or underwater regarding their HOA, and how should they handle it?
I think you got to start from the place of understanding that you do have rights, right? That's a fundamental understanding, is that just because someone's on the board, just because you're being targeted, doesn't mean you don't have the ability to declare war, right? To push back on some level. And so I think that one of the best starting points is really for that homeowner to understand their CCNRs, to understand those governing documents. And again, I speak for California, but a lot of states have similar sort of entity structure. And if they don't understand it, spending a half hour or an hour with a lawyer who understands this type of law could be tremendously beneficial. And I think there's a misconception, just because you talk to a lawyer doesn't mean you're automatically retaining that lawyer. A lot of the consulting that we do is a homeowner will come in, we'll help walk them through the CCNRs, we'll get an idea of sort of where the breaches have occurred, but we often recommend self-help initially before they hire a lawyer. Because in my mind, if you can avoid hiring a lawyer and resolve a dispute with an HOA, that's a huge win. It always has been. Now, sometimes an attorney intervention is inevitable, but I think to start, it's education, empowering yourself through the governing documents, and just understanding how those governing documents give you rights. They also give the HOA rights, of course, but it also carves out what the HOA should be doing and what they should not be doing. And so I think education as a fundamental principle.
I want to direct everybody to your website again, because they're going to be able to find links to your book. You mentioned getting quite a bit of attention regarding the book. Could you talk a little bit about what has been some of the things that have really riled people up and what's caused so much attention associated with this?
Yeah. So when I wrote the book, it was really to identify a solution to a problem that everyone's been talking about, these bad HOA. And when everyone talks about the nightmare of the bad HOA and how horrible they are, but what I saw was lacking in the market was the solution. How do you approach this? How do you lift the fog of war? And so when we released it into Amazon, for example, within the first week, it became the #1 bestseller in 6 categories, which was phenomenal. It was such a positive response from the market. And I think it's been one of those areas that's been overlooked because if you actually do look at the books out there, a lot of the books are very pro HOA. Hey, if you're on an HOA board, this is how you should run a meeting. This is how you should collect fines. This is sort of entity structure from a corporate formalities perspective, but almost nothing on the homeowner side of things. What to do if your board goes bad or goes rogue, nothing really empowering that base. So the response has been tremendous from the consumer market, the homeowner base, but also media. We've had a lot of reach out from major newspapers, major publications, major media sources, very interested in this area of the law. Because again, I think if you back out and you go more global, everyone hears the HOA's perspective, the HOA side of things, and very few have been beating the drum of homeowner rights. And that's been a huge, I think, refreshing change in this space. It's just been void for a very long time.
Going to the real estate investor side of things, has your team worked with a number of real estate investors? And maybe you could even share a story of somebody that might be trying to rejuvenate a property and the HOA was a problem and you were able to solve it.
Yeah, interestingly enough, we worked with a lot of investors on the due diligence side of things, which is before they invest, right? So we've encouraged this before historically, before you buy, whether you're an investor or you're just a homeowner and you love the home, right? It's a beautiful home, do some due diligence, spend a little bit of time, maybe requesting the CC&Rs, read the CC&Rs. If you want to go a little bit deeper, maybe go to the court website of the local jurisdiction, pull up that association. Because if there's a bunch of lawsuits being filed, whether it's from the HOA or from homeowners, that might be a red flag. So we've assisted investors before they've acquired properties, running that due diligence report, pulling up the court website, looking at the CC&Rs. Are there red flags within the CC&Rs? What are those red flags? Let's say they're drafted in 1973 on a typewriter. That might be a problem. Or if they're riddled with ambiguity that shows a lackadaisical approach, typically with a lot of ambiguities within the CC&Rs, that gives rise to a lot of disputes. By running that preliminary analysis before the acquisition, we can save a lot of headaches for the investor. And you don't necessarily need an attorney to do it. You could hypothetically do it on your own, I guess, depending on the level of sophistication of the investor. But I think it should be part of the due diligence if you're looking to flip a house or invest in an HOA or within an association.
Mhm. Just to remind everybody, we are talking to Luke Carlson, and you can learn more at lscarlsonlaw.com. If you found some value in what we're talking about, this show only grows if you share it with an investor friend. So please consider doing that. If you're watching us on YouTube, give us a like and subscribe and feed that algorithm. So I'm curious, is there any kind of state and local laws that kind of help rein some of these rogue HOAs in? You've pointed to stories we hear about where the HOAs can be nightmares, but maybe you even have suggestions where some legislation should be passed to keep things under control a little bit.
Yeah, this is actually perfect timing. So part of our push is, at least in California, has been for reform, overhauling parts of the Davis Sterling Act, or at least supplementing it. And part of the strategy behind our reform, sort of pitch to Sacramento, if you will, was really educational. A lot of policymakers, lawmakers really don't understand how huge of a problem this is. So what we've always looked at it as becoming more deterrent in nature, meaning if a bad HOA is found guilty of malice or just really egregious misconduct, right? Selective enforcement, willful violation of the CC&Rs, let's ramp up the damage side of things. Because if you look at it, if you're an altruistic board member and you approach the board, it's not going to deter you from being on the board, because, the likelihood of you found that you've engaged in some sort of malice is very slim at best. It's the bad board members, though. It's the self-dealer. It's the tyrant who might say, well, the liability, if I get caught doing this, is so drastic, maybe that will deter these individuals from joining the board in the first place. So that's what we've been discussing with a lot of lawmakers, policymakers. And just recently, I think through these efforts and efforts of others, a new law just got passed in California, AB 130, which has been tremendous. It's limited the ability for an HOA to fine, given a certain amount. And it's really sort of pulled back their power because a lot of associations have weaponized the fine process. Fines have gotten exorbitant, $2,000, $5,000. I mean, we've seen it all over the spectrum. And this has really reined that in tremendously. It was the first thing that I saw for a very long time fall in California, where Sacramento is understanding the issue, at least in California. They understand that this is a problem and they're chipping away. And I think it's moving in the right direction. So I was very pleased to see that. And so we'll be going up to Sacramento within the next couple of weeks. We have some strategic meetings up there. Again, a lot of it is really just educational, allowing policymakers to understand the problem and then working with them, sort of collaborating, right, in terms of workable solutions. And this is nonpartisan, or it's bipartisan in nature. It doesn't affiliate with any specific party. It's a win for everybody at the end of the day, keeping bad HOAs in check. Now, I'm not opposed to a good HOA. I have no issues. I think actually associations bring a lot of value. And when they're functioning well, you're preserving fair market value, which is good for investors. That's what investors want to see. But when they're bad, they do the opposite. They tank fair market value, they depreciate value. And so if we can keep these HOAs in check and curate very strategic and bespoke sort of laws, that's a win for everybody.
Outside of your book and do you have a podcast?
Yes.
Yeah, I was going to say, outside of your book and podcast and website, what other resources are available so that people have access to, like, so that they have some direction? A lot of this is like, you don't know what you don't know. Like, what questions to even ask?
Right. So at least in California, the act that we follow is Davis-Sterling. And so you can access that online. There's a lot of really good websites now where you can sort of navigate it very quickly, find very specific provisions that apply to you. Even with the advancement of AI, I don't know how comfortable everyone is using AI. Now, AI is imperfect. I wouldn't say it's really a legal tool. It's not there yet, but I do believe it's sophisticated enough to give you general direction. You got to verify because, again, hallucinations and all these horrible things. But if you were an investor or a homeowner in a particular state and you started to interact with a chat GPT on a very basic level, hey, what are some of the code sections that apply to this? This is my concern. Where should I be looking? You got to take the next step. You got to verify that. You just can't trust what it says, but it could serve as an initial sort of directional platform, if you will.
We're going to change the subject just a little bit, but based on the amount of people and HOAs that you are talking to, things can get extremely emotional when it comes to this type of thing. I'm sure people feel attacked. I'm sure you've probably felt attacked. Could you give a little like insight as to how you're balancing this emotional state and how some maybe tools or strategy that other people could maybe leverage to kind of keep things at arm's distance?
Yeah. So I think that comes down to two things. When a homeowner comes to us, they're obviously, or they're typically very emotionally charged, right? This is an attack of where they live. It's very personal. And so there has to be a tremendous degree of empathy, and it's real. I mean, when we meet with homeowners, I understand wholeheartedly what it's like to be under attack because we've dealt with it for so long. And so empathy is key to really understanding these disputes. The attorney who approaches this too clinically is going to miss everything entirely, right? Because some of these issues appear very small and non-issues, right? It might be the board keeps attacking me because of my mailbox. Now, on its surface, you're like, okay, it's a mailbox. Who cares? But it's a power struggle. Now, yes, it's materializing as a mailbox, or that's the flashpoint for it, but it goes so much deeper than that. It's someone who's sort of imposing their power wrongfully, illegally on someone day in and day out, right? And that becomes a huge friction point for this person, which disrupts quality of life. And now where you live, you constantly are looking over your shoulder. So there's a high level of stress in that household now, all over a mailbox. So empathy, I think, is key. You really have to understand the magnitude of these disputes. Because again, if you don't, you're missing the whole dispute onto itself. So I think empathy is key. But the other part of it is when you go into an offensive posturing, when you are leveraging the rights of a client, or when a client or a homeowner is going to the board I think there is where you have to scrub out the emotion and turn it into a very clinical offense. Meaning, when I talk to homeowners and I say, you need to bring this to the board's attention, you need to break it down as, hey, this is a violation of section so-and-so of the CCNRs. This is what the board is supposed to do. This is why they're not doing it. This is what I demand. Let's work this out. Now, the psychology there makes sense, right? They're very frustrated. Of course, they want to yell at the board, but it doesn't help in a legal sense. The more objective you can be, the more sort of unemotional you can be, is actually going to better the homeowner's argument long term. Because eventually that very histrionic email or letter might go in front of a judge or a mediator, and it's going to not help the homeowner. But if the homeowner can be calm and collected during the whole process, they look like the rational actor. Let the bad HOA reveal their fangs, but you want to stay in a position where you are clinical about it. You're very matter of fact. And I think that's a huge win. So I think my advice for homeowners is to stay as professional, polished, and objective as possible. And that's hard to do. And I get that. But listen, if you write with a lot of venom, maybe write everything out and then the next day come back and take out the venom and keep to the facts. Because at the end of the day, that's going to move the needle more so than you yelling. And then I think from a professional basis, there has to be a tremendous amount of empathy in the space. Because again, if you don't have it, you're going to miss the impact on these homeowners' lives dealing with a bad HOA.
Do you happen to have a story from your practice that's had a profound impact on you?
Oh, I've had countless. Let me think of one that comes to mind. Yeah, actually, I do. So it was an interesting case. So the spectrum of cases that we see are all over. Some are just tremendously sensational and very dramatic and sort of very high level. Others tend to be a little bit more mundane. But I remember dealing with one, which really, I think, hit the empathy chord. And it was a lady who was dealing with cones, of all things, parking cones. And what was happening was her neighbor was putting a cone in the middle of a cul-de-sac, and she would back up and it would require her to get out of the car, move the cone. And it was sort of this thing, which on its first value, when I first met her, when we were first talking, I didn't really understand as to why she wanted to lawyer up and as to why this was such a huge impact. She said she went to the HOA. The HOA brushed her off, said, we don't care. We're going to ignore this, even though in the CCNRs, very clear, it says no cones. But how did this come to a head where she needed to meet with a lawyer? Well, the reason was her husband was deathly ill. And she had this huge fear that if she had to rush him to the hospital at any moment, all of a sudden she would have to back up into a bunch of cones. And these cones would potentially undercut her ability to get her husband to the hospital within the life-saving amount of time. And I think that why that was so impactful was it shows you how even these small transgressions have massive impact. And she was losing sleep over this. She was very stressed about this. And the neighbor said, no, I'm not moving this. I'm not going to work with you. I don't care. And it just kind of stonewalled her. The board stonewalled her. And now she was out of options, even though she pled the story, but it never resonated, or they just didn't listen, or they didn't care to listen, because they never got past the surface issue of it was just a cone in the cul-de-sac. But if you look under it, it's actually a lot more to the story. And we eventually got involved, and there's no cones today in that neighborhood. But that's a very interesting story of how deep these cases can get when on their surface, they don't necessarily seem like these big sensational cases that you typically think about. But for her, it was a matter of life and death, even though that wasn't apparent at first glance. I think that was a very telling story of this space, even though it's simplistic in nature.
Well, now I need to know why somebody was so fervent about having a cone in the cul-de-sac.
Yeah, it was for I forget exactly why he wanted it, but it was something to preserve his property, right? Like he was doing something, maybe it was a detail that he got every now and then. That part, I don't exactly remember why it was so important for him, but it was frivolous. It
was very frivolous to the point where it's not even worth trying to remember.
it was something so foolish. Wanted to make sure the path was clear in case there was an emergency for her husband.
So how do you envision the future relationship between homeowners and HOAs?
I hope it gets better. Our mission at this firm is to empower, to educate, and to reduce the number of bad HOAs. I think that's possible. But it's just been one of those overlooked areas that didn't have enough of a spotlight on it. but that's changing. And I think at the end of the day, once the homeowner base understands we have tremendous rights, we can enforce these rights, we don't have to tolerate a bad HOA, that's where you start to get change. And I think you do it on different levels. You do it from a homeowner empowerment level, but then you also start working with the policymakers. And eventually, with enough time pressure, you get to a better point in the space. That'd be my goal. I think that'd be a tremendous win.
Mhm. Well, before we jump into the rapid fire and close out this episode, could we kind of summarize some key takeaways for everybody that might be listening to ensure that they understand their rights when it comes to dealing with HOAs?
Yeah, and I'll do it from a investor standpoint. I think that's important, obviously, because given the nature of the show. But I would encourage investors to not shy away from HOAs. I think that they could be a tremendous opportunity. One, because less people want to interact with them because of their legal complexities. But two, understanding that with the right amount of due diligence, these become potentially very viable opportunities. And due diligence, looking at things like the CC&R, going and exploring the community, look at the state of repair of the common areas. Are they well maintained? Are they not well maintained? These are telling signs of whether you're dealing with a good HOA or a bad HOA. A really good way of conducting due diligence is to go on the court website, pull up that association, do a business search, and see whether or not the association is filing a bunch of lawsuits or vice versa. But those are really great ways to start vetting a community. And I wouldn't say just because it's an HOA, it means it's off limits. I think it just requires maybe a little bit of heavier lifting, but there might be a better ROI at the end of the day.
Yeah, and I can understand the disruption that flippers could possibly have in a neighborhood, but more times than not, it seems like there'd be more benefit than anything else in revitalizing a property that needs it. But every once in a while, you hear of those reservations. And I understand it. We, as real estate investors, not always have the best of reputations either. So I guess it's just a double-edged sword on that.
Right. But no, I hear you. If it's a legitimate flipper who's looking to better a home and that would better the community as a whole, and so long as they're complying with the CC&Rs, the governing documents, it could be a win for everybody.
Well, if you're ready, Luke, we'll jump into the rapid fire questions and close out this episode. But before we do, remind everybody lscarlsonlaw.com.
No, I think that was pretty expansive. It was best tips and strategies for investors. I think that's always going to be there. And ultimately, the empowerment of the consumer base.
Well, if you're ready, we'll jump into the questions and close out this episode. What lie do real estate investors often tell themselves?
As I see it, they don't need to do as much due diligence as they should. But when something looks too good to be true, it often is not. And assuming you don't need to do the due diligence, I think you're lying to yourself. You want the shiny object. So there's this bias that you have, and you're going to sort of make it happen when you should probably step back, do the due diligence, do the analysis, and really look at it objectively. Not because you want it, but turn it on the data itself.
I wonder where that comes from, because it could be that there's a lot of real estate training and gurus, if you will, that really push the concept of massive imperfect action. But there needs to be a balance there, that there is something to be said about analysis paralysis, and you got to get off the bench. But sometimes you need to take a breath too and just do what you suggest.
Yeah, I think at minimum, just come up with at least a skeletal checklist. Fine. I'm not saying you need to spend months and months of due diligence, but there should be at least 10, maybe at least 5 major boxes that you check on every property. And I see people blow right past that. I'm both commercial and residential. We have a lot of commercial clients, and they get into trouble because they didn't do their due diligence. And had they spent an hour, 2 hours, they would have avoided a lawsuit. And now we're in a really bad situation because a lot of what we do on our side too is litigation, commercial litigation, failure to disclose, non-disclosure issues. Yeah, we do a lot in HOA space, but we also see things go south on the commercial side of things. And when they do, you're looking at the case, and a lot of times it was like, hey, if they spent maybe 6 hours analyzing this whole thing could have been avoided.
If you could go back in time and give your younger self a piece of advice, what would it be?
It's not legal, but invest heavily in AI. It's the wave of the future. It's one of the biggest breakthroughs. It's imperfect, like I said, but its capabilities, I believe, are endless. I mean, I'm kind of saying what everyone else is saying, but it's like we just found electricity again. AI.
Do you have a book recommendation, or what are you reading right now?
Every year I read the Meditations by Marcus Aurelius. Tremendous book. He was the emperor. He was the most powerful man in the world. And it's interesting to read his diaries and his thoughts about the world. I think it's a grounding book, regardless of where you are in terms of your career, your profession. It's a very humbling read at the end of the day. So I would encourage that.
And finally, what strategy or tool have you implemented that has had the biggest time-saving impact?
I think I've already telegraphed that. We've invested heavily at this firm into AI. And interestingly, not for work product, just internal functionalities, just processes. We've developed our own AI platform that we use in-house. And again, it's just to speed up the things that we do internally. The systems, the sort of things that would require a lot of man hours to do have now been made more efficient with these AI systems, which is I've been very impressed with.
Well, I really appreciate your time here today. One last time, it is lscarlsonlaw.com. That's going to be a clickable link in the show notes, but I hope you consider coming back again sometime.
It was wonderful to be here. So thank you so much.